So welcome to Rock Creation Techniques 2. We're going to get straight into it. We're going to create a new substance. We're going to use this database setup that is included in your download. I'm just going to call this one RCT2. Relative to parent and 2048, 2048, and relative to parent. So this is just my base setup file where we pipe all the shapes in through this background on this blend node, and we get our AO and normal set up already. So for this tutorial, we're going to go into some techniques how to add details to our rocks that we started building in the first rock creation techniques. And for those of you that didn't participate in that, we're going to use this file that I've also supplied, which goes through all the examples we built, and it's just a couple of different rocks in here. So I think we're going to start with this one. So we can just start by hooking this up here, and we'll see our little preview down here. We can crank up our AO strength a little bit. Yeah, something like that. And let's just start moving this off to the side. You don't have to use this. If you were part of Rock Creation Techniques 1, you could use that rock, or if you have your own little creation, you can use that as a start instead. The only thing is that you need like a little bit of detail or a little bit of shaping, so the detailing can have something to work with. So the first thing I want to do here is just create like a little bit of secondary detail. We have these really strong shapes in here, but we want to do something that adds to this shape and complements it. So we're going to start with shadows node. And we're going to put 8. 200. And this will be 0.5 and soften it up a bit. Then max out the samples. I'm going to run this into a quantize node. So what the quantize node is doing, it's clamping out the range, and you define how many bands you want. So if I set this to 15, now based on this input we get 15 steps here, or actually based on the full range. So actually we can count the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We get 6 in here, but if we, here we see the full range. And we run this into edge detect, because we want to capture what these bands are doing and add that as some little bit of sort of cracking. Let's do 0.4. And we're going to run a bevel through this. And the bevel we can set to 0.1. So what we get here is we can actually blend this on our shape. We'll put multiply on here, and we set this to 0.35 or something. Yeah, now we get a little complement shape. The nice thing about this shadow node, which is essentially it takes this height and it calculates shadow based on this light angle. So if I move this around here, we now move our cracking around essentially. And that seems to complement them nicely. So I have a node that will be available to those who have access to this tutorial, and it's on also my Gumroad. It's called Dette Directional Warp. So we just drag and drop this from your folder in Windows in here. We'll hook this up to height, and we'll add a clouds 2 node here. Just default settings. We're going to start just breaking these guys up. And this one also has a direction. Let's do something like 120. Let's crank up the intensity a bit as well. And this one has, this one is essentially a directional warp from multiple directions. So here we only have one vector, one direction, and here we have 3. So we can hook this up here. Now it's just starting to do something that offsets from the shape, so it's reminiscent of the base shape, but it goes a little bit off, which is always good. We're going to do yet another step here, where we're going to put a slope blur as well. And let's see, we will crank this up to max, set this to 0.5. Set this to min, and we want to use the same detail here. So if you zoom in here, so this is what we had, and now we have a bit more layering, although this is too much noise at this point. So what we can do is we can take the same noise that we had before. We could blur it here, but a cheaper trick that gives you a little bit better performance is to dump in something like a simple node, like a safe transform, and I'm actually going to set this scale of this node back. So you see, like, this base node here is a 2048, and setting this safe transform back to -2 up here gives us a 512, which gives us a little bit blurrier output from that node, and now we get chunkier shapes. So if you see the difference up here, which is essentially the same thing as blurring. So moving on here, we will create a little bit more of a shape detail. We can start by grouping this. So if you select all these nodes and hit add frame, now we have this group that we can organize this. We can call this secondary detail. We can move this whole chunk away. And so now we have some nice, like, semi-cracking detail in the depths of our shapes. I need something more to break up these flat areas, so we're going to add a cells node here. Cells 1, which has these really plush type cell pattern. I'm going to set this to 12 to just to scale. And put a directional warp in here. And this is going to get warped by our main shape. So let's crank up our intensity to a lot, 60. Let's do maybe a 15. Like, keep it on an angle that uses the same angle as our cliff direction here. We can do another blend here, and this we're going to set to subtract. Oops, I'm going to put a foreground like that. We don't want to do this much, obviously, so we want to set this back to maybe 0.1. You see, it starts messing with some of these tops a little bit here. But one problem that's occurring here now, you see, You see the levels here. We have this dark spot here, and as we're subtracting stuff, like this dark spot is getting darker and darker. So we have to be wary of that. We never want to go full white or full black, because that essentially is no value at all. So we will set a histogram range in here and set this to 1. We can leave this at maybe a 0.6. Then we can crank up this one a bit more. And you see here it creates these kind of like layered cuts on here. There's a really key lesson in here whenever you do any type of detail layering, is that we always want to warp our new shapes that are coming in. If it's you know, a cells pattern, or if you're blending anything on top of it, we want to warp it based on the main shape, so it never looks like superimposed on top. Like now actually the cell pattern is modified to flow with the shapes of our rock, and you'll see we're going to do that over and over and over in this tutorial. So let's call this, let's move this off a bit, keep it nice and tidy. We can call this additional shape detail. So now when we have a little more information to work with here, we're gonna do a warping stage here. We're gonna use this node, and actually the exact same type of noise. So if we want to make this connection go here without losing this connection, we can hold shift and drag this one here, and it will rewire it back. A pretty useful tip. And you see now when we have a little more to work with, we get a pretty cool result here. We should adjust the direction a little bit on this, and I think it's a little bit heavy on the displacement here. 3 vectors. We can actually step through and see what. V2, and I'm setting the angle for this so it's distorting more along, you know, if it flows with this direction, counter the shaping of our base shapes, which has you know, this type of direction. So we want to go counter there. We can put a little frame around this guy as well, and call this base distortion. Base warping, maybe. You can move this noise up here, since it's a kind of global noise we're using. And I want to keep it neat, so I hold I hold Shift and Alt and click. And we can move these guys around. Move this out of the way a bit more. So right away we're starting to make something that looks a little more natural, like rocks. You know, if we take out any of these steps so far, you know, we're kind of back to something more generic and less realistic looking. And at any point, you know, once you might be done with this tutorial, you can go in and, you know, we can change the light angle, for instance, to move some of this detailing around. You can change the amount of steps and the warping and even these patterns. But let's continue here. Obviously we're making rocks now, so cracking is an essential element, so we should add some cracks on here as well. So I'm gonna build just a new simple crack generator up here. We're going to start with the tile random. Obviously, if you have your own utility nodes with cracks, you can use those, but it's always good to get a refresher how to rebuild these. So let's set this to something 8 and 5. Let's go to scale, a little bit smaller. Scale random. We can set that to 0.5 as well, just so we get a little offset on here. Let's do a rotation random as well. Let's keep all these at 0.5, I guess. Offset, yeah, we can do a full offset. Offset random 0.5, and random will start pushing stuff off in all directions, so we want to be a little bit careful. Let's keep it at 0.5 as well. And the last part we need is the color random. We're going to just use the distance node here. Hook it up to both. Click this only source and do a 500 or something. So now we get, since these have random rotations, we now get a little bit warpy patterns here. That's a good base for our cracks. Then we do an edge detect. I think we're gonna, this kind of roundness looks really cartoony, so we're gonna take that out. As we're going for something slightly more realistic. Set this to 1. We'll do a little blur pass on this guy. And the blur we set to maybe 0.4, and I always tend to set this one to quality to 1. Blend this back in. Set this to 0.1 maybe, just so we get the core of it is darker, because that's where the crack is the deepest, and then it falls off a little bit smoothly. We can tighten this up with a histogram scan just a little bit. 0.6 just to make it a little bit darker. A little bit tighter like that. And then we'll use a slope, blur, grayscale. I'm going to set this one to 32, and we're going to actually use the same detail as we used before. We used this this lower res 512 version of our cloud noise. That looks absolutely crazy, but it's because we have the wrong modes in here. So we're going to set this one to min, which takes all the dark values and pulls those out. We're going to dial in our intensity here to maybe something like 2, just so we get a little bit of interesting pattern going. Maybe 2 was too much. Unintended. Okay, so here we have a nice base setup of a crack pattern. Can add a frame. Call this crack pattern. And this, now we're going to blend on top of our shape. So I'm going to get back to what we did before, where we start with this, and we can delete this incoming connection. We use our directional warp node here again, but we're going to, let's see, we're going to put this guy in the intensity and then the cracks in the input. Let's move this one back. Let's keep it neat and readable. And somewhere around there. This is a good program if you have OCD, so which I do in certain cases. So here we will just crank up our, let's see, we'll do this one, yeah, 160 might be good, 155. Just to make it flow over our shapes again, we'll try 25. And then we'll do 3 just to make it warp in more directions. We're going to blend this on top. Let's see if we can find a good angle. I'll set this one to multiply. And that's way too intense, so we're going to take our opacity down to 0.1. And here we can play around with our direction. What you see now is cracks go over the surface. If I didn't have this one at all, if we set this one back to 0, you see how it looks like someone just stamped the crack over top of the shape. But if we crank it up to 15, you see here this crack is actually like flowing over here and going down based on this shape. And we can do a bit more. If we do too much warping, we can sometimes see that we lose detail. So we shouldn't go too crazy here. But this is more to taste essentially, and what you're going for. This looks pretty cool to me. We can obviously go back to our tile random here and mess with our amount. You know, you want bigger cracks across the surface. Some of these might be a little too intense. We can lower this even more, maybe point. Maybe that looks a little bit better. Let's do a safe transform. So let's add another layer of cracks actually. We can take these as they are, and we can take these and we'll tile them twice, or you can do a 45-degree rotation, which is almost like a 1.5, because this safe transform node is the only one that works with tiling with rotations, but you can only do 90-degree, or you can do 45, but you can only do full tile steps. So if you're using the regular transform 2D node and rotate it off this way, if I press space here to view the tiling, you can see now that we actually break the tiling across. You see this red border. So I would recommend always using, if you use this regular transform node, to only use it in this sense, where you just move and offset without scaling. If you work with tiling textures, if you work with other stuff that doesn't require tiling, like this node is free for all, you could just scale and do whatever. So I always recommend using this. We can go back here and hit space. So we'll try 45, which is roughly then twice or 1.5 as much. And we can run this through at levels now just to make it a little bit darker. And you can obviously manipulate here, but sometimes I like going in here to get the numeric values. So we do 0 and 1, and we just crank up this one to 0.65. And we're going to clone this like so, and we do our shift and drag and hook it up there. And then we'll do this on top of here. Let's actually do 2, because I want this to be a finer cracking. But as before, we're gonna use our directional warp node again, just to make sure we're warping this based on our shapes. And we can do a little bit offset direction to just get a different look. Obviously this looks a little bit intense right now, but so something I use a lot is just create a mask here, so we can hook this one up as a mask, so which means we're only going to get these cracks at the peaks, but actually we can control this by adding a histogram type HIS histogram scan, and if we set both of these to something like 0.5, we essentially remove these cracks from the bottom of the shape and just on these tops here. Still too intense, so I want to take this down even further. This should be like a even smaller level crack pattern here, so we should just make sure it shows up a little bit less. So you see it's starting to layer stuff. It makes it look slightly more realistic as we go. Actually, this one is still intense too. Yeah, something like that. And we will clean up our network here again. Beautiful. And we'll frame this and call this cracking. Yeah, so far we have a bunch of details on here. I'm going to show you a trick that I use quite a lot. Let's grab these guys and move them off again so we have a little more space. We'll add a directional. Let's just select this line and type dr. Put this directional warp. So yeah, we have a lot of these crack patterns and detail layers on here now, and we have a really uniform shape that goes through it. So sometimes I want to just break that monotony that's going on in that all the shapes relate to each other so much. And you know, like rocks have been formed for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been cracking and grinding on each other, and there's pressure above that's like messing with how the whole cliff face is put together. So to simulate some of that is we can take one of these gradient linear, and you saw I flipped it here 90 degrees because the default is just straight this way. And if we set these to be just flat like this, and we take a midpoint in here. So if I set the warp angle of this node to up or down, and we can set this one to, yeah, maybe something like 30 or something. So we're starting to, if you look here in the 2D view up here, we can start like introducing some sagging. We can mess with this curve to just introduce a little bit more like a natural play in the rock itself. We need to be careful here though. We don't want too sharp of details because it's going to introduce tearing. So if I give you an example where I make it really sharp like this, then suddenly we have this really weird cut through here, and that's what we don't want. But we can do stuff to soften that up, or if you add a couple of stair steppings this way, we can always go in here and put a blur node to control that. Yeah, we'll set this to, Jesus, 10. And then we can mess with this if we want to do 60. This is a really good trick that I use quite a lot. Just introduces more, just makes it more natural essentially. let's group this and call this something like shape distortion. Let's clean this up a bit and save your work. So we've done a bunch of small cracking and layering. Let's introduce a little bit of pitting in the rock here. So we'll use black and white spots. I like the black and white spots 1 the best. Don't ask me why. We'll use a high pass. So essentially we have so much contrast in here, so I want a uniform level of pitting. So essentially what I will do here, I'll show you a little bit beforehand here. So what I want to do here is just crank up the levels to isolate some of these dots, but since this one has too much macro noise built in, you see this whole dark pattern here and these eyeballs up here. It doesn't work well, so that's why we do a high pass to remove all that small detail. And we can set this one to 8. And then now if we run it through this levels, now we have a uniform pattern without the macro shapes. So I want to set it something like this. We can actually go into numeric panel in here. 0.5. That looks good for a start. And we'll use our directional warp node again. And we'll use the most recent version of our cliff. Set this one to 30. And we can use 1 vector on this just so they don't get super crazy in terms of distortion. And we'll do a blend here. And these guys will subtract. And we'll want to do something really low here, as you see. Looks pretty good. A little bit intense still. Can do it even lower. So now we have like this uniform pitting pattern, but it's still too much, so we can use this trick again where we just use our opacity. So imagine this is maybe this is caused by acid rain or something, but it's not hitting these deeper crevices of the rock, it's just hitting the tips here. It still might be a little too much, so we can go back here and adjust our levels to get something to our liking. We can even do if we do a blend here, we can do our safe transform trick again. So essentially I want to get a little bit blurrier details here, but I also want to keep these sharp shapes around. So let's set this to 0.5, and on our safe transform we're just setting this back to maybe as far as -3, which yields a 256 texture. You see how blurry that looks, and when it's combined. So this is what we had, and now we have, you know, something a little more blurry. Yeah, like that. A little more aged look. And now maybe we need to crank this up a little bit more. Essentially what we got is like a sharp cut in the center and then a blurrier pit essentially around that, which looks more natural. Let's make this neat again. So we'll frame this. I'm going to call this Pitting. So let's add a few more small detail layers. So we'll go back to our shadow node. Actually, we can just, you could just use quantize directly from your base shape, but it's kind of like it's too on the nose, and there's no way of controlling it without modifying your main shape. That's why I like to use the shadow node in between. So let's set this to 2. Just have it straight this time. Crank up the samples to 16. And we can add some contrast to this using the histogram scan. And yeah, that looks pretty good. Yeah, same here again. We could just, we can mess with this. And if we would do, even that, or just straight, like there's no way to change this pattern and to tweak it to our liking. So let's blend this in here. If we put this on the top, we retain this 16-bit, which is what we're building now. This node always forces everything to 8-bit, so make sure you put it in the top of your blend node. You see here it adds these small layers in here, but they're all super binary, so we want to blur these. So let's put a blur node, and we'll set this to 0.1 and 1. But you see, since this quantize node is a parent of this node, this output also goes into 8-bit mode, which causes this stair stepping. So we can actually correct that here by setting that to force that to 16-bit. Just want a little bit hint of it on the edge. Maybe a 0.15 or so. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit less. And then when we blend it in here, we can lower it. Immediately adds a little more interest here, but we will actually throw in one more of these guys. So we'll use this as the intensity input, and we'll shove this guy in here, and we'll set this one to, let's plug it in first. The cool thing about this is it's doing the same thing, but now we're actually like offsetting it slightly, which means it's less just drawing the height curves on the shapes. It's, maybe one time back in geological history it was using the base height, but since it's been warping and wind eroded, like these cracks don't, or these layers don't line up exactly with what's going on right now. So we'll see what that looks like. We'll offset this a bit, see if we can get something that looks a bit more interesting. Yeah, that looks pretty cool how it comes in. But it flows over this ridge instead of just like this. It's just drawing it straight. This is way more interesting. And same with this, you could, you can play around with different masking techniques to see like where you want this detail to be. I think for now, just want this to be on wherever. And still we can go back and play with this to get a different look. I can soften it. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Let's see if we want to soften it a bit more, maybe. Yeah, it looks good. So we will group this and let's call this layering. We'll yet again make a little more space here. Let's move this off. So we'll look at, you know, when you go through a graph like this, when you layer on and cake on more detail and you subtract and whatever you do, you can get more and more dark spots that get darker and darker. And obviously we can always use our histogram range to compact the range so we can add and subtract more stuff on top. But I want to show you a different trick that I use, which is this, let's see, height blend node. And if you use a safe transform node, we can do, if we connect them this way, so obviously now we're using the same detail and blended on top of each other, but if we start offsetting this, we can start filling in detail that we already have created in the gaps. So if we double click here and look at this old one, and then this is the new one where we're now starting to fill in some of these gaps, but with the height offset set to 0.5, all the new detail is going to come in at this exact same height, so we're going to get a very noisy composition. So what you can do here is you start pushing back this new detail that we introduced back in these holes here. So we can set this to something 0.7 here. So now if I move that one back, and we can see what these guys are doing. Yeah, essentially we'll get these little chunks back in these pits. And they have all the details, since we're just using the same shapes, they have all the details that we've been generating from the beginning of the graph. And this node has 2 sliders here. So usually I use contrast just to crank it up to maximum, and you get these really sharp transitions. You see, yeah, this transition in here, but we can actually use this opacity, or the contrast slider, sorry, to introduce a little bit of fading detail between. So if we set this one to, yeah, maybe not that low, but if we get it to something like that, you see how it kind of introduces this little lip around it here, which is kind of nice. So that's a good trick to add some detail back in. Now let's just leave it at 0.8 like that, and we can mess with the transform. And I'm mostly looking up here into the 2D view up here to see that I actually get details in these darkest cavities up here. Because a texture like this, if you have this on a huge cliff face or something in a game, this cavity here might start repeating a lot. So that's why we're doing this, essentially getting filling in some detail where we lost it before, essentially. We can group this too and call this eliminate dark spots. And with the option on this node, obviously you can go in and tile this detail, so you get, you know, extra level of higher frequency noise in these pits. I wouldn't recommend doing anything like rotation here, because, you know, with this texture, which is quite directional, this starts looking really weird really fast. You see this kind of stuff now, it's like doing the opposite of what your main shape is doing. Something like that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Maybe a little more this way. Yeah, it takes a little bit of dialing in. So let's look at a couple of tricks we could use to reshape our texture here, or our height information rather. So we already established, you know, our base shapes, you know, super early on back here, but it's not too late to go in and change this shape. And what I mean by that is we could use the curve node. So we can change this fall off from a linear fall off based on our height input here to maybe, like, you know, inflate it a bit. Or you can, you know, make it drop off in certain areas to create, essentially to carve the rock a bit. Maybe this is not what we're going for in this specific case, but you can do a lot at this stage already, even if we have like all this detail on here, and it's actually quite interesting to play around with. We can do stuff where this even starts, you know, bulging up for some reason. This is just a trick I wanted to show you. We can erase that, but play around with this and see the capabilities. It's cool for, you know, like getting more use out of the texture that you already have. And you can make it look, you know, alien or whatever, like, you know, some weird type of erosion pattern on it. You can introduce a couple of more of these stair step layers. You know, suddenly here we have something that doesn't resemble anything we did before, but still being interesting. You can also use this the classical gradient map tool. We should just make sure we set it to grayscale, and then we'll do this shift. We could use the gradient map tool to create these kind of stair stepping effects. That's how I usually use it. So either you can do something like where you go in and pick a gradient, and yeah, we can essentially pick our own gradient here. This can introduce some kind of secondary noise that either you blend in, you know, just like this, you blend in some of this weird noise on top, like so, or we can, if we clear all here, click again. If we want to create stair stepping noise on a bigger scale than we had before, you can, if you add 2 points like this and you start just pushing 1 point closer to the other, we add like this kind of manual quantization. You can do stuff like this as well, where you add 3 points and we add a pit in between the two. Yeah, there's loads of interesting ways to reshape, but I think for me the most common way I use it is exactly like this. I create a couple of points across like this, a couple of secondary points to go with those, and then just like start adding a few layers. Pretty interesting. You can keep it like this, and if you want to fade out this detail, you can add a blend node and just hook your original shape up before, and then you can play around with how much that effect is visible. Leave it on for a little bit, just half, and we can call this reshaping. Essentially, like, this is really good to create stair stepping, and the curve node is really good at doing inflation or erosion type effects, since it's a curve, right? So we can manipulate stuff in a curved manner, which is really hard to replicate using this node, because there's no way to define a curve here if you don't have a bunch of different values in here. Yeah, so it's starting to look pretty cool here. We now have like cracking and pitting and layering at various stages. With all this noise, we can actually look at our normal map here. If you double click on a normal, starting to look pretty cool. I think for me that it's always easier to look at a normal map to see the shapes correctly. But I'm a little bit worried that we have too much noise in here, so I've created this node. It's a low pass node, so I'm going to throw that in here, and it's available for you guys that purchase this tutorial for free. If we hook that up, you saw how it softened it there. So if you let's actually look at our normal and see what it's doing. So this is without it, and this is with it. And what the node is doing is it's evening out some of the noise. So we can say how many steps we want it, and for something like this I would just do the full 4 steps. You see how everything feels just softer, and it's going to eliminate a lot of tearing and stuff. If you let's say you try to render this in Marmoset or something like that and put displacement and tessellation, it's going to eliminate tearing in small areas, like these cracks and where you have a bunch of noise. And you can tweak the amount. Here, I think for something like this, I would just go full. I also have this fade parameter here where we can essentially just fade out what it's doing back to nothing, essentially. For something like this, we're going to keep this full on here. Also gives it that aged look, where like more wind eroded look, It's like this is really sharp and crisp and everything, but here with this, like all the years of battering of rain and wind has worn it down. So let's put a frame on this. We just call this height noise, and if we can spell, that helps. Perfect. I think after this stage is where I would go into adding some micro noise or detailing on here. So let's add a fractal sum base. This is sort of my go-to noise for this type of stuff. Let's also add a slope blur here. So I'm not going to warp this based on the shape. I'm going to use this sloper node instead. So we're going to move this up to 32. And we got to put this, yeah, maybe even higher than 15. Well, let's start here. We'll blend this on. Put this to overlay. That looks pretty cool. I'm gonna blend this one back with the noise just to get a little bit of that micro noise like this. So if we want to get this at maybe 30% or something. So we get a little bit of both. We get this directional type noise, but at the same time we get some of this pitting noise. Or fine noise, whatever we want to call it. Dial it in. So overlay, for those of you who are not familiar with that blend mode, it only works on the grayscale stuff. So if you have black or white pixels in here, it's not doing anything. So it's only affecting stuff in the grayscale spectrum. We can go back to our normal here and check. Yeah, it looks pretty good and rock-like. And the last thing we'll do here is just group this or frame this, and we'll call this detailing. Everything nicely grouped. I showed you guys a couple of different ways of adding details. Hopefully it was useful. Play around with these. Play around with this graph and change the different settings to get a different result. You know, play around with the cracks, add more or less, and you know, more or less pitting, maybe a different kind of pitting, maybe some, you know, leakage or stuff on here, erosion. In this base node that we started with, I also included the other examples from the Raw Creation Techniques 1. So we can actually step through these and see what they look like with this graph. And you can actually go back and, you know, change this accordingly, so like it creates a appealing final composition here as well. Obviously now, since we've been working on this fourth example, it's geared towards working well with that, but it should work with any of these. But maybe some values are slightly off, but it looks pretty cool with most of these. Yeah, for something like this, we might want to go in and change to fix some of these sloping areas, for instance. And this was the initial like pillowy rock that we had. Yeah, it looks pretty cool as well. And let me end with looking at the final render. This is just a marmoset, so this is what we built today. Just put some jazzy lights on this guy. But you can really see these this layering on the edge where, you know, we have controls for that. You can move that and shift that around. Cracking goes across the surface here. It looks pretty good. Yeah. Hope you guys enjoyed, and see you on the next one. In this tutorial we will look at various ways of generating rock shapes. So this first example will be very basic, but it will explain the theory behind making rocks pretty well. So let's start with Perlin noise. Set this to 5, and then auto levels. And then we need a tile sampler, and we will set this to be a paraboloid shape. Scale it up 5.5. Let's do a 6 and 8, and then we'll take this and we'll hook it up to scale, and we will use the scale map multiplier and set it to 0.85, and then we'll move down here and set this offset to 1, or yeah, let's set it to 1.1, and the offset of 0.5, just so they overlap each other. And we'll change the color input to use scale. Actually, we'll use color, and we'll hook up the color here, like this. Okay, so this is our primary rock shape. We can hook this up to this node down here, so we'll see what it looks like. And now we can actually, yeah, let's add a little frame here. We'll add a comment, so as we remember what we did. Primary shape, I can pull that on top. So this comment will always stick with this node, so if you have a node selected and right click and say add a comment, it will always stick with it. So let's do our secondary shape, and we'll use the same values, but we'll just add more of these. Do 10 by 10, and here we can type secondary, and these two will combine. So let's select this node and type blend, and we'll hook this one in here, and we'll set this one to min darken and set it to 0.4, but we'll also invert this one first. So select this line and type invert. And you see now we start to get something that looks a little more like a rock and looks like a balloon. Because this min darken blend mode is just blending the darkest pixels, and therefore you get this carving effect. But we don't want to go too far this way, where it just obliterates the whole shape, since we have so many dark pixels now in here. So we'll set it to something around 0.4. Let's clone this. We'll do another step, and we'll call these detail shape. And this we will, let's crank this up to, so you see we step in increments here. We have our large primary shapes, secondary shapes, you know, almost half size but randomly dispersed, and then our detail shapes are the next level of scale. And let's add another blend node. Select this node and type blend. Connect this one here. And we'll set this one to subtract, but we don't want to go this far. Obviously this looks pretty cool and rocky, but it's not what we're doing right now, so we're setting this to something low like this. And you see what it's starting to do is just start introducing a little more fractals on here. I think we can set this one to something really low. Let's select this. Let's crank up the AO so it's easier for us to see. Also, I should hook up auto levels here, because you see here we start with kind of like a normalized range, but after combining it, we're flattening the range more and more. We can see by, you can see the histogram by using the levels node. You see we're using these grayscales here, and as we're combining, we're losing more and more, whereas the auto levels is flattening, so it uses the whole range. So if you're doing a lot of combining and with blend modes, make sure to once in a while stick in auto levels to get the full range of grayscales back. Yeah, this looks pretty good. It still looks a little bit balloony or cartoony, but if you're making a cartoony type or stylized type texture, that's fine. But to make this look a little more natural, we can add a directional warp in here. And the directional warp node is, it's going to push the pixels based on this intensity input. It's going to push them in this direction and with this intensity here. So let's just hook this one up to the intensity input, and you see, since it's horizontal here, start pushing it this way, but we can actually try to push it a little more down just to break up these shapes, just to show you guys. It's another way of introducing more random shapes, a little more fractals, but without adding more of these chiseled cuts. It's starting to look pretty good for this first example. If we darken this, we can see a little more. Specular response can be easier to see the shapes that way. So we're not going to go into any actual detail, and we're just looking at these initial shapes, and we're keeping the shapes really clean. We don't want to over warp. Let's say if I would, you know, start adding tons of noise in here, like black and white spots. It's really important when you make rocks to not obliterate shapes. You know, as soon as I start putting something like this in, it's easy to just, we now like ruined all our shape reads here. So with all my rock creations, I try to keep that at a minimum, and you just create shapes like this first and try to dial them in based on the reference and what we're going for. So now we're using the same directional warp node here, but we're pushing the shape based on itself, which means you shift weight around. So where we have a lot of bright pixels like this area, and we use this directional warp node, we're actually pushing this part up or down based on the direction in here. So it's kind of like geological aging, where you can make the rock kind of droop or be pushed around, but it's a natural way of adding some age and a good way of warping your stuff without introducing the noise that I talked about. In this example, we're going to look at creating rocks from a Voronoi source. So just a clean template file here. We start with the tile sampler, and we'll set 6 and 3. Let's take this X size down to, I want to make really thin ones here. We can do a little size random. Let's do some position offset. I always do this 0.5. I want to angle these a little bit, so we'll go down here to rotation. Set it, maybe not that extreme. Yeah, something like that. And we can do a little bit of rotation random. And we will do color random. And then we will hook these guys up. Let's see if we can offset these. There's a bunch of these touching up here. Let's make them first a tiny bit wider, and then we'll try to just offset them more. We don't want too much touching here. That looks pretty good. Then we'll run this through a distance node. If you hold Control, you can move these inputs, so we want to hook it up here as well, and then we'll do histogram scan up to max, and we'll set this one to 5,000. Let's see, maybe we'll do less random positioning. Something like that, and then we'll do a little bit of mask random as well. Remove a few. Okay, that looks like a decent start. We can always go back and change this later, but this will be our start for our Voronoi pattern here. Edge detect. Crank down this guy here. Actually, I need to do a little bit of touch up here. That looks all right. And in between here, we'll put a directional warp. So imagine these are just huge blocks of a cliff. We'll use one of my favorite nodes to distort shapes, which is this crystal node. We'll set this to 5. So instead of having this perfectly straight mathematical looking nodes, we'll introduce a little bit of distortion here to them, make them look a little jaggedy. We can just leave them like this. Just leave them straight. And this we'll set to just 1. So we have these thin lines. And this we're going to run into a flood fill node. So the flood fill is grabbing all these individual items that are divided up by this black line. So you see it creates like blocks out of these. And then we're going to set up a little bit array of different shapes here. So go into flood fill. If you type flood up here, you'll get all the shapes. So we'll get a couple of gradients here. And these are all hooked up to the flood fill. We'll do one with heavy variation. We'll do one with, yeah, just like this, straight, or maybe like just, these have a direction that's slanted, so we want to follow sort of the same angle. And then we'll do one that's kind of like more of a top down, do a little bit of angle variation on this. And then we want to do another flood fill, which is the random grayscale. And this one we want to, wait, no, we'll want to do actually this guy. Flood fill to B box size, which is the bounding box size. So the smallest shapes will be the darkest. And this is always good to hook up to auto levels. Okay, so far we've built a lot of nodes, but we have nothing visible on screen, but that will change pretty soon. I'm going to try to get rid of this tiny little thing here. Let's see. Yeah, something like that. And we hook these up to gradient maps. I do this so I don't have to, a lot of people layer, 24 of these or, 10 of these. I like to just add as few as possible. So if you hook this one up to the gradient map tool, you can actually go in here and redefine what this one should be. So you can tighten up these grayscales. Let's actually start layering some of these and hooking that up so we can get a little bit of a visual first. So we'll combine them with the min darken. So you see what this kind of approach can give you. It gives you like, I really like this approach because it gives me a way to design my shapes how I want them, so it's easier to follow a reference this way in terms of like how large shapes are going and what direction they're going. Actually, I can show you like a rock I made that's using this very same technique, but obviously more layers. But so actually this rock I made recently, and I'm using this very same technique because I can really define the directionality and how the cells are going and how they're cut. Let's just continue blending these guys together. We want to clone this one as well. And same with this one. And here it's just a matter of dialing in. Obviously, I don't work from a specific piece of reference right now. So let's just eyeball this in a bit. Let's take this one down so we're not getting distracted. dial this one in. And this one should follow our angle. Let's take this top one, do something like this. Let's do less, 0.15 or something. And then this, we can move this one back. Like I said, this one to black. It's starting to look like something, and this. Let's do a little bit of variation here. And we'll drag in these colors more. Cutting off the little edge of that thing. I'll pull this one in more. You can really design like how you're cutting the rock in here, which I really like. And here we can do a little bit more. Yeah, 0.25. Do the same angle. Yeah, something like this. And then at the end here, we blend on our bounding box sizes. So here, now the biggest shapes are pushed out. Let's exaggerate our AO a little bit more so we can see. In this stage, we can also mix in like a bunch of, let's say for this one, since we have really soft and nice gradients here, we can blend in the Perlin noise to something low, and set this as an overlay. And if you can see the difference. Instead of getting these really sharp cuts, we now get, rounded, more organic cuts. So we can blend this overlay in potentially here as well. But now it's kind of doing the same thing, so we can do like a transform here. You can just grab this and move it off a bit, or even do a rotate. Don't ever scale this, because this actually breaks tiling, this transformation node. Okay, it's starting to look pretty interesting here. So we have this. You can see this method creates a whole lot of tearing. You see the tessellation here is not liking this shape. So what I'll do here is I'll do a histogram range. We just flatten the range a bit. We can crank it up ever so slightly again. And what I typically do here is I'll add another one of these edge detect nodes. Set this to 2. Add an extra gap, and we'll add a bevel node here. We'll set this one down just to it closest that gap. And then we'll multiply this on top. But also we have, aside from, you see the beveling that I added there on the edge, we have this gap that we want to close as well. So we're going to do another distance node here. We're going to hook up this into source, and then we're going to use this edge detect in here. And you see now that gap is closed. We can set this to something even though to get it like a little more of a fade there. Looks a little bit better. I'm going to do something else here in the end to fix the rest of that tearing. Yeah, to that reference we looked at before from my ArtStation page, like essentially what you would do is like essentially you can go in and redesign the direction of these this noise to do more of that axis, and then scale up how long they are essentially to get bigger shapes. Yeah, super powerful way. Just to get back into this, slightly mathematical look again. We don't want to overwarp our shapes, but we want to do add another crystal node in here and maybe set this one to something like 6, just to start introducing that. Let's see, 15 maybe. Start breaking these lines up. You see like some of these unnatural looking lines. And let's just add a bit of detail here. So we'll add let's add a safe transform node. I just want to add like a little bit of a small cut shapes that goes through these main shapes. So you can add one of these safe transform nodes. Just have it offset or do something different from your main texture. And then we're going to do a slope blur. Set this to min, crank up the samples, and then we will select this node and find the blur node. If we compare, you see this here, and if I select this, we're kind of like nudging the nodes, but we haven't combined it back in yet. So if we move this one back, we can here add a blend node. And set this one to min, darken. We can tile this one. And we'll do just a little bit less. So we add smaller hints of damage, but without warping our whole shape, essentially. This one is too much here. Let's set this one back to 1. We'll go down a little bit lower. Yeah, this is what we're looking for a bit more. Kind of just these. You see this little cut here. These types of details. And to take care of the tearing, which is still fairly evident on this, I have this low passing node that I've created that should be included where you found this tutorial. Essentially it's just blurring in steps. You can see here we're getting rid of, so we can crank up the steps and the amounts. And now our tearing is pretty much gone. This node is also good at introducing a little bit of soft detailing. So if I fade this one out, you see this is the old version here, and with the low passing applied, it creates this kind of like softer subshapes around here. Let's have a look at another example. We'll use a tile sampler to start with again. This we will attempt to create like a layered cliff, much like, let me see, something like this one here, where we have some big shapes, but it's cut up with these, whatever we call these striation lines. So we will start with polygon here. And we'll do a 5-side. Like this one up here. Select pattern input. We'll do a 4 and a 3. Actually, we can hook this one up here right away. Just the size, so we'll want them to be a little bit wider like this, and crank up the scale. We will continue down here by setting this one to, let's say 0.1, do the offset 0.5. This shape select and hit BL like this for blend. Do a gradient with min darken, and you see right away we have some kind of weird shaping going on, but we want these to go off an angle like a 0.3, so create some layering. And then we'll just do a little bit of color random on this. 5. We'll do auto levels here again. And this is our start shape. Let's just crank up a little more AO. Yeah, so this is our base shape. We will now go in and like carve lines out of this. So we use, let's see, not tile sampler, we can use this tile random. And if we set the X to 1, we'll remove this split. And we'll remove this interslice, which is the gap in between. We set that to 0. And then we just add the color random. And we'll see, we'll add maybe one more band. Let's try 6. Crank up the random Y so we get a little more difference between them. Let's also do let's start with this actually. So we can select this line and we'll do a directional warp, and we'll use this one. You see right away we're starting to create these bands, but they're obviously super mathematical, but it's a good start. We can also go in here and before we do this directional warp, we actually warp these lines based on this shape. And set this to 15. Maybe it's a little bit more. You see, we're starting to break up these lines so they're not perfectly straight. We can do that. We can push them down. That looks pretty good. So let's, before we do this, since these shapes are so straight, we want to add another directional warp in there and use our little friend from before, the crystal. And we'll go with 5 is usually a good start. Just giving it a little more of a natural feel. Maybe we'll do 6. That looks pretty good, but it's a little too much. Okay, that looks pretty good. You see here in the normal map, like these edges that we're now introducing when we're tearing this shape apart, they become kind of 0 edges, which looks really weird. So we need to emphasize these a little bit better. So we can use a edge detect here, and we can try with 2 to begin with. Let's try 3 maybe. We put a bevel here, and we zoom in a bit, and we'll try to dial in so they just meet like so. And on this guy we'll remove this roundness as well. We don't want to, we want sharp features here. I think it's really important for me to, at least the start shape are really sharp and crisp. So we want that here as well. So let's blend this one on here, select the line, type BL, and then blend this one on top. You can try multiply first. It's a bit too intense here. That looks a lot better. Also, the bevel node has a little bit of an issue with these kind of jaggedy edges, so we can go in and smooth them a little bit. We can also try min darken. Min darken, that's the one we want, yeah. And that's not doing anything, so we actually have to put a levels node in here. So we can dial that in. I think if we use this, we can actually try to scale this one up more. So just this bevel. 0.5 maybe. Yeah, that starts to introduce like a little bit of a carved edge. A little bit better on here. And another thing to do here is we can start blending this guy back in, multiplying this on top so the bands have some vertical spacing. But actually then we can go in here and say not color random but based on Y size, which then means we get this, the smallest band gets pushed in the most. We can go back in here also to, if we set this back to 0, like there's no offset. But it's kind of nice to have that kind of a little bit of an offset. We can break up these edges a little bit more and make them a little more natural. So let's move this off to the side. We can fit a couple more nodes in here. Let's add a slope blur. And then add a save transform, and we'll do it on this guy here. We'll tile it twice, and we'll hook that up into here. Crank up the samples, set it to min. See, it's craggling out that edge, but we can also put a blur on here so we can just soften the effect. I can tone this down a bit. It's pretty interesting. I'm going to tone this effect down a little bit. Another thing I like to do is something I call shadow carving. So we'll use the shadow node. We can either use it on itself. So let's set this one to 2, for instance. Crank up the samples. And then we blend this back on top of itself. And we do a min darken. Or a multiply. And we can play around with a light angle. So what this one is doing here, let's actually set this one back a bit. It creates a little bit of interesting volume, since if I remove this completely here, this thin layer here is like just completely flat and perfect. But if we add this shadow here, excuse me, it creates this a little bit of a lip down on this shape, which is kind of cool. But we can try set this to min and then just do levels on this to actually carve a bit better. And let's see if we find a better light angle. It's a really interesting way of adding some extra shapes to this.
This is looking a little bit bonkers right here. Let's keep it here. And also we could use just this mask itself. Obviously way too strong. Take out that node for now. Let's do multiply actually. Seems like it's, yeah, it's picking up that guy there and that guy on the top. I think we'll actually flip this around. See here, we get a little more of the ledges here, so we get a little more of the effect overall, the whole thing. I think for this, to add another layer of detail on top of this, we'll add some cracking, and we can start with splatter circular. And do discs. Crank up the radius and radius random. You can do a bit more of these. Scale them down. You can play with the shape. Ideally, I never want them to touch. That's what I'm trying to dial in there. Distance. Something really high. And then we can just mess around with, see if we can get a more interesting shape. Yeah, that looks alright. Maybe a bit more patterns. We'll do the same thing here. I think we'll directional warp. We can see if we can just reuse this crystals node from before. And we'll do edge detect on this, remove the roundness, crank up this, add a bevel again. Just get them to touch, perfect. And then we can do the same thing again. We just take this one and run a directional warp again. And now we will use this pattern. See some cracking happening over there. Can use this guy again. Use the shadow carving. blend this one on top of this. We can see what it looks like with min darken. Oh yeah, it's just doing a little bit up there, so let's go with some multiply. So for all these layers we're adding, we just want them to add something to the composition. And same thing is going on here, where we need to address these edges, so we can try using our bevel up here too. To fix that. I'll set this one to 1.5 maybe. Looks pretty good. And we can do the same thing for this. We can, I guess, reuse this. I guess we should use our most recent shape here. We should also blur this. Yeah, that's a pretty good start for something like this. And this one doesn't have to push in the same direction. It could push, you know, a little bit up or down this time, when the other one is pushing vertically. So we get these, or horizontally. So the bands are pushing the rock this way, but this cracking is pushing it up or down instead. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Let's look at another example, a little more traditional, with a tile generator. This is a node that's doing a lot of similar things to the tile sampler, but it's good to have an understanding of what the alternatives are. So yeah, let's just put 6 and 3 in here. Let's just first create a shape, so we'll start with a gradient. We'll blend this to polygon. And for this, we'll set the sides to 4, and we'll try to scale this one like bigger than allowed. Let's flip the order like so. And we'll use this one in here. So let's see, we switch from brick to image input. We can actually hook this one up over here. Let's just lay these out. And then we'll go down to scale and scale this up. And we need to change the blend mode. So right now it's adding everything together, but there's so many of these and they're layered on top of each other, so you can't see. So we switch this to max, and let's see here, luminance random, offset that. Here, now it's starting to look like something. Let's do 0.5 and 1 there. We want to rotate these guys so they go off of 45. It's always good when you're creating a rock texture to not have it go straight up and down. A diagonal texture like this will kind of offset the tiling. It wouldn't look as obvious as when it's repeating, when it's straight and gridded. So this is always a good idea. Now we'll put some position random in here. You see, you might notice the similarities with the tile sampler, but this one is just a little more lightweight. We can do a random scale here, maybe 0.25. Looks like a pretty good base. And let's hook up our crystal. To get a little bit of this ever important natural look. And let's do splatter circular. And we will up the radius on these and do maximum radius random. Like make them a little skinnier. Same thing here, we're essentially just creating a Voronoi pattern again. We need a distance. Scan. Let's up the amount a bit. And we will do that so we get them all straight, and then we can rotate them. We want these to go counter this direction. You can actually make them a bit taller. Okay, that looks good. You copy this node, so we apply the same type of distortion, but we can go in a different direction with this. I can up the intensity a bit more as well. Add another directional warp here, and we'll use this pattern. Breaking up that. I run edge detect on this. And here we can run a bevel, or you could also just run the distance node. They're essentially doing the same thing, but this one doesn't have any of the options that the bevel node has for softening. But if you just want to sort of close the gap, you could use this one just fine. You can actually add one more layer here of distortion, so we can distort this shape based on this. So let's do that here. It's always good when you have different elements that are going together when they're distorted by each other. Just looks more natural, and when shapes that go over each other are coming together like that. So now where this pattern is going over these ridges, it kind of gets a kink on it. We'll add a slope blur. We can add a Perlin noise for this, just to break up these kind of perfect lines. We can play with the scale on this. Let's run the auto levels here first, and then pipe it into. I'll do a min darken. That looks pretty cool. And we can go in here and put a level here if we want to make these less prominent. Cracking. And we can actually tone down this one. And this is a really good start as well for a natural rock formation. There's more stuff we could do here. You know, you can add another layer of these cracking patterns on a finer scale, and we could also swap out this whole start. Let me show you one that I've built from before. Just paste that one here. Here I'm using the tile random to stagger some shapes. I'm not going to build this one live here, but I can scroll through so you guys can see what the settings are if you want to recreate this. Tile random is a really interesting node where it lays out patterns on a grid, so you can you get minimal overlap. Obviously here in this example I've cranked up the scale a whole lot, but essentially the default usage of the node is the patterns don't overlap, so you can create really interesting layered effects like this. We can swap this one out, and maybe we can just reduce the amount. Still works for this. Yeah, so this is another way you can create some natural rock formations. So for this example, we'll be looking at a sheet cliff with thin layers. So let's just get into it over here. We'll start with the shape node, and we will pick a disk, make it a little bit smaller. Then we will use, let's see here, one of my custom nodes that should be included in this download. Otherwise it's free on my Gumroad. We'll put a crystal down here. This is essentially just a directional warp node, but it can push in multiple directions at once. Let's set this one to 4. And just want to break up this profile a bit. So this section here, usually directional warp is just one direction, but if you select direction vectors 2 here, it's going to push from 2 directions at once, and then you have 3 and 4. Let's use 2 for this. What we want to stay out of is getting weird, like little small tendrils or stuff that kind of loop back on itself, so watch out for that. And we can set this one back. We don't need full resolution on these, so we set these back to 512, so this output is 512. So we copy this. Let's make 3 of these. So for this we'll just try a different angle, just so we get a different shape from the other one. Yeah, like exactly this kind of stuff is what we don't want. That looks different from this. So we have this, and then a third one. Try some complete other direction here. And we can try with 3 vectors maybe. So we have this, this, and this. And what we can do here is, if we make a generator out of this later, we might want to stop these shapes from turning into something weird, like we were talking about, like that. You know, if this noise will change, that might happen. So we can actually lock this random seed to always being 0, which means for us in this graph, regardless of how the user changes the graph in the end, like these will always remain the same base shapes. Okay, so let's hook a bevel up to these. And we want the bevel inwards. Let's do something like that. And 3 of these. And then we will do blend. Note that you can't select this one and hit blend. It will, actually it works now. It didn't used to work because this one has 2 connections. That's good. We need a gradient. And we'll do min darken. No, actually we'll do multiply on this. No, min darken, but we'll flip this one 180, because we're going to create a sheet rock where these will layer on top of each other, so we want it to be dark on the top and bright at the bottom. And we'll copy this, and we will hook this one up like so. So we have 3 different shapes, and we can frame this. We're going to go to start shape. Just move it off a bit more. And then we'll do one tile sampler. So in the tile sampler, we start by selecting pattern input to hook all these up. So we want 3 And now we have 1, 2, 3 here. So we start by putting this guy in here, this in here, and this like so. We'll set this to like something 8 and 3. We want to crank up the scale. So let's do 4. We'll crank up the overall scale as well. That's starting to look like something. We'll do a little bit scale random as well. See here, we're starting to get something. Let's leave it 0.4. We're gonna have a little bit of a position random here. Like a 1, a little too much. Yeah, it's like even layering. Do offset 0.5. Want a little bit of rotation on these. Just as we talked about in the previous example, just have them go straight across. It's better to just have them go on a slight angle out for tiling. Super minimal random tiling, maybe like, because if we do this too much, it's gonna go into crazy town right away, and we still want our layers. That looks pretty good. And then a little bit of color random on this, maybe like 0.25 or something. Yeah, that's starting to look pretty good. But this is our primary shape. We're gonna also add a secondary shape here. And here we will, every time you duplicate something like that, make sure you double click, because I don't know how many times I copied something and pasted, and then I'm actually tweaking the one I don't want to tweak. So if you double click, you make sure you're staying on that one. Yeah, we double up a little bit here. We just want to create on these layered sheets, we want to create a little bit of cracking on the top of the edges here, so we don't want any color random on this guy. Like so. These will just be used as cut shapes. And we'll put a directional warp down here. Let's select this guy, type dir, and we're gonna warp it based on this. And just so these layers do something similar to these. So they're warped based on that shape. This obviously looks all weird on here, but once we combine them, it will look pretty good. So we will do this guy in here and this guy like so. And then we'll do a min darken. Actually, we can just look at what this shape looks like. Looks okay. Let's crank up the AO again. Actually, we'll put in our auto levels here. And now with this, we get this, but you see we're carving way too deep here. So we'll set this one back to maybe 0.2. And now you see we're just affecting the tips of these. So there's no layering happening like back here, only at the edges. Let's tone back this scale a bit. Yeah, it looks better. Let's do a little more layering here, so we'll add a safe transform. And then we'll just offset this a bit. Oops. offset. And then a little bit in Y as well. Yeah, let's do clean numbers. And do height, blend. And we'll want our new thingy in the bottom and this in the top. See, we're creating way more layers here, but it's too strong. So crank this one up to max. And this 1.6. So we get a little more layering going on, but more of these thin layers. We can actually use this guy here to dial in exactly where they show up. I think, yeah, that's good. Let's see. Looks like these guys maybe are stretching a little bit too much. We can tone these guys back. And maybe tone down this a bit. You can see maybe we want to tone down this scale as well. Yeah, it looks pretty good. I'll crank up this AO again. So now they're extremely straight. There's no like, there's no wobbling going in and out. So let's blend some noise on here. We can use Perlin noise. Set the scale to maybe 4 or something. Getting some of this action on top of what we already have. Again, we're just trying to make it look a bit more natural. And after this, let's do directional warp. Let's add our crystal. Set it to 6. Technically we have this one here, but I think this one is scale 4, so we want to use a new one. Let's see. So we can really see the crystal shapes in here, so I think I want to blur this one a bit. Whoops. Select. Blur. Maybe like a 5. Maybe a little bit less. Still want to get our sharp reeds. This you dial in based on taste, essentially. That looks pretty good.
let's add a little bit of noise on this. So we'll add another directional warp. And put a clouds 2 is usually pretty good for this. And we want to push it down. And you see we're getting a little bit of that rock. Like the rock detail on there. I like what it's doing with this edges, but I don't like really what it's doing with these flat areas. So what we could do then is like we'll blend this. We can multiply this on top. So essentially where it's dark, it won't do any directional warping. So it means we get more on these edges and less on the flat tops, because we still want this really sharp cliff. We can do like a histogram scan on this. Just to sort of like isolate the tips. Yeah, something like that. It's a good start for a sheet rock. And that's the final example in this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed going through these examples with me, and see you on the next one.